the topic is about tribalism, and I wanted to make it, relevant, of course, to our mindfulness practice. So with that, I want to invite you to think about this topic in the context of your own tribal conditioning and how that shows up for you in your mindfulness practice, in your everyday life. The point being that our socio-biological heritage, ancestral heritage, is tribal and communal. And that has a very pro-social aspect, Some of you may be familiar with a book I highly recommend, the book Sapiens by the brilliant Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari. And in that book, he traces the history of the human species. And he addresses how small groups have been so necessary for our survival. And so tribalism has a very positive connotation. And often in discourse today, of course, it also has a negative connotation. The negative connotation has to do with divisiveness. We see this along political, ideological, religious, cultural, ethnic lines. But the positive pro-social aspect of the tribe has to do with a sense of caring, tending, protecting. We could easily say that this is a Zoom mindfulness tribe right now. So one of the things I got or became aware of in looking into the literature on tribalism is the idea that if we address only the negative aspects of tribalism, we can fall prone to the paradox of being in the anti-tribal tribe. So I want to try to address this in a more, holistic way. So I talked about the functional aspect of tribalism, the cooperation, the safety, the caring for community members. Of course, the dysfunctional aspect has to do with creating an enemy that doesn't look like or sound like us. I was recalling recently a story by a past secretary, I guess, administrative assistant, we say these days. And this individual spoke of feeling fearfulness at the gym because someone on the stationary bike next to her was speaking a different language. And maybe to all of us, that seems, relatively normal, especially if you've traveled much. But this is how tribalism can imprint. We spoke about cognitive bias last week, and this certainly connects with the cognitive biases and the unconditioned reflexes that separate us from others. I recently saw a bumper sticker just the other day that said something to the effect of, what part of God's creation is the other? What part of God's creation is the other? And I thought that was a clever way of saying it, because if we expand our perspective, we see that we are all of, this earth tribe without waxing in a new age sort of way. Some of you may be familiar with the excellent book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink, B-L-I-N-K. In a very pithy way, Malcolm Gladwell addresses the unconscious reflexes that create perceptual biases in all of us. And then this can constellate around tribalism, of course. So the dark side of tribalism has to do with vengefulness, hatred, and bias. So these are the shadow aspects of tribalism. We don't have to look too deeply to see that in contemporary society. So for the individual now, this can result, of course, in psychological blindness, not seeing our inherent biases. And one of the things about mindfulness practice that makes it more wide-reaching and relevant and not prone to lapsing into what some detractors or critics have called McMindfulness, like McDonald's mindfulness, is to extend the practice of mindfulness from beyond the individual to the culture, to the web of relationships in a social, ethical, and moral way. Very important for having a comprehensive practice of mindfulness. So I want to make that point. And of course, when we're psychologically blind, we can also become blind to aspects of ourselves. I was musing about the metaphor of tribalism and how that can be applied to our own experience. You know, we can say metaphorically, poetically, there are tribes inhabiting our psyche. And if our primary identification, our identity, for example, is being a kind, gentle mindfulness practitioner, we may miss the passive aggression, sarcasm, criticism, and unkindness that passes through not just our mind space, but gets filtered into how we perceive, how we act upon the world, and how we speak to other people. So I want to encourage us all, and I'm speaking to me as well, to stay open to the idea that we've all been conditioned for millennia, to think and act and speak in tribal ways. And when we're not aware, our energy can be diminished, and our skillful ways of acting upon the world can certainly be diminished. So stay open to understanding that this is part of our tribal heritage, and notice how it shows up. So some of the skillful aspects, and then we'll open it up soon to discussion, is that we want to notice when our differences of opinions and beliefs trigger our judgments, anger, and gossip. I realize gossip has a social function. It connects us, you know. But I also notice that gossip can be tinged with judgmentalism, especially if you're on a one-on-one talk and there's this third party or group. It might be a whole big political group, for example. We won't mention names. You know, we want to be very inclusive here today. And that has a reflexive othering function. And also on the other side of that, notice when you attribute the goodness of others who are different than your tribe, when you attribute goodness to environmental circumstances. You know, the only way that person could have this stance is because somehow something rubbed off from my tribe, you know? So be aware of how you attribute goodness to the so-called other. And notice when you might, again, deny or suppress your own internal tribes, so to speak, that metaphorical tribe, and maybe project that out on other people. So last week I mentioned that wisdom and compassion are seen as two wings of a bird in our practice, and they are necessary for that bird to fly. In the context of looking at tribalism, wisdom is about understanding the roots of tribalism and how they function, understanding that we are conditioned beings. And that understanding helps to unfetter us. Compassion also brings a sense of warmth to that understanding so that we can be more inclusive, so that we can also see the common humanity in everyone, regardless of what tribe they're in. I'm recalling a story just in the moment here whereby Linda and I were traveling, I think it was from Malaysia to Bali, or Bali to Malaysia, from Bali to Malaysia, and we were on a train, and we encountered a man dressed in full, I would call it Arabic garb, perhaps. He had a white tunic. His family was with him, and he looked at us and he engaged us in a friendly conversation, and he said, "Where are you coming from?" And we said we had just returned from Bali, and he leaned into us and he said, "Would Bali be safe for my family?" You know, And it really connected me to that sense. And this was actually very close after 9/11. So there was a lot of intensity and meaning around travel at that time, about a year post 9/11. And it really touched my heart, to know that someone who might be seen as the other just from his clothing that he was wearing has the same, of course, concerns for safety for his family. So lastly, I just want to say that we want to remember the 3 poisons and 3 antidotes to those mental poisons of Buddhism, which can help us to create space from our tribal conditioning. The first poison is attachment or greed, and loving, or rather letting go and generosity is the antidote to that attachment or greed. In the context of mindfulness practice, it often looks like letting go of our thoughts. In everyday life, it might look like letting go or unhinging from our beliefs and opinions that seem tinged with judgment, for example. Second poison is aversion or hatred, which definitely separates us from a so-called other. And the antidote has to do with loving kindness, compassion, a sense of warmth, and recognizing the common humanity of others. And then the last poison is ignorance, just simply not understanding how these conditioned aspects and reflexes show up within our being. And the antidote has to do with understanding. So ignorance is the poison, understanding or wisdom is the antidote. And ignorance, of course, can result in stereotyping the other. And understanding creates the grounds for connection. Simply spending time with people that seem to be in the other camp can really break down barriers. Businesses are doing this today in terms of diversity training, for example. People who look different from one another, working on a task together over time, a bond is created, because that's how us human primates are designed to band together. So why not call upon that urge to connection to widen the circle?